I used to believe that loyalty was the one thing in this world that couldn't be faked. You could fake love for a while. You could fake attraction, fake interest, fake 100 small tendernesses if you were patient and careful enough. But loyalty, I thought, showed itself in the boring moments, the unglamorous ones, the 3 a.m. phone calls and the quiet years nobody was watching. I built my entire life on that belief, and it took exactly one Thursday evening to burn it to the ground. My name is Julian Cross. I was 28 years old, and for 6 years I had worked as the personal financial strategist for the Vale family, which was a polite way of saying I laundered money so cleanly that even federal auditors called it art. I wasn't born into that world. I walked into it at 22 with a finance degree and a talent for numbers that made dangerous men very comfortable, and I stayed in it because somewhere in those 6 years I fell in love with Damian Vale, the only son and heir of the entire operation. Damian was the kind of man rooms rearranged themselves around. Loud without needing to raise his voice. Magnetic in a way that made grown men who ran drug corridors and shipping fronts go quiet when he walked in. He had a jaw people wrote poetry about and a smile he handed out like currency, and when I was 22 and desperate to prove I belonged somewhere, that smile felt like the only safe place in a very unsafe world. We were together for 4 years. I learned every version of him. I learned which whiskey he drank when he was worried and which one he drank when he was celebrating. I learned that he slept with one leg always thrown outside the blanket, that he hated the sound of ice cracking, that when he was truly frightened his voice dropped an octave and he started calling people by their full names instead of nicknames. I organized his father's finances, his brother's tuition payments, his own private accounts, and I did it all while loving him the way you love something you've decided is permanent. He proposed to me on my 26th birthday, in front of both families, with a ring that had belonged to his grandmother. I said yes before he finished the sentence. We were supposed to be married the following spring. People sometimes asked me, in the early years, why a person with my education and my options would choose to work for a family like the Vales at all. I never had a simple answer for them, because the truth was complicated in a way that didn't fit into small talk. I grew up watching my own father lose everything to men who were technically legal and morally bankrupt, a slow bleeding of our family's small business through fees and loopholes and predatory contracts that no court would ever call criminal. By the time I finished my degree, I understood something that most of my classmates never had to learn, which was that the line between legitimate and illegitimate money was mostly a matter of who wrote the laws, not who caused the most harm. When I met Damian at a university fundraiser, introduced by a mutual acquaintance who had no idea what door she was opening, I wasn't looking for danger. I was looking for someone who understood, instinctively, that the world rewarded confidence over goodness, and I found that understanding in him immediately. Our early years together were, if I am honest in this telling, genuinely happy ones. Damian took me to dinners in cities I'd never seen, introduced me to his father with a pride that felt, at the time, entirely sincere, and built a life around me that I mistook completely for permanence. I became indispensable to the family's operation quickly, not because I sought power, but because I was simply better at organizing complicated, dangerous money than anyone else they had access to. Within 2 years I was managing accounts that moved through 6 countries. Within 3, Damian's own father had stopped making major financial decisions without consulting me first. I tell you all of this so you understand what I actually lost on that Thursday evening. It wasn't only a relationship. It was an entire architecture of trust one had built brick by brick over 6 years, in a world where trust was the rarest currency available. I found out 3 months before the wedding. It was a Thursday. I remember that specifically because Thursdays were the day I finalized the week's numbers, and I had left the estate early because a client meeting had been cancelled. I drove to Damian's private residence, the smaller house he kept separate from his father's main compound, intending to surprise him with dinner. I still had the bag from the restaurant in my hand when I let myself in with my key. The house was too quiet in a way that should have warned me. I remember thinking, foolishly, that he must be asleep on the couch. I walked toward the bedroom the way you walk toward a truth you already suspect and desperately don't want confirmed, slow, deliberate, hoping every step that I was wrong. I was not wrong. Damian was in that bed with Marcus Reyes, his own second in command, The man who had stood beside him at every important meeting for the past 5 years. The man who had been at our engagement dinner and toasted to our happiness with what I now understood had been a completely straight face. They didn't hear me for several seconds. Long enough for the restaurant bag to slip out of my hand and hit the floor. Long enough for something inside my chest to go cold and stay cold. Damian turned first, and his face ran through an entire sequence of emotions in under 2 seconds, shock, panic, and underneath all of it, something that looked disturbingly like relief, as if a performance he'd been maintaining had finally been allowed to end. He said my name. I told him not to. He tried to explain. I told him there was nothing to explain, that I had eyes, that I understood the scene perfectly well without narration. Marcus had the decency to look ashamed, at least, though decency arriving 3 years too late means very little. I walked out of that house and I did not cry until I reached my car. Then I sat in the driver's seat in the dark and I cried the way I hadn't cried since I was a teenager, ugly and uncontrolled, my whole body shaking with it. It wasn't only the betrayal itself, though that was enormous. It was the specific architecture of the betrayal. Marcus wasn't a stranger. He was someone I had trusted with my own safety in a world where safety was never guaranteed. He had access to Damian's schedule, his security detail, his private conversations, because he was supposed to be protecting all of it. Instead, he had been taking the one thing that was supposed to be mine. I spent 2 days in my apartment after that, and I won't dress it up as anything more dignified than what it was. I didn't eat properly. I didn't answer calls. I lay in bed running the last 4 years backward, looking for the moment I should have seen it, and finding, infuriatingly, that there wasn't one single moment. It had simply been happening, quietly, underneath a life I thought was solid. Marcus tried to call me twice during those 2 days. I didn't answer either time. On the second attempt he left a voicemail, halting and clearly rehearsed, telling me that what happened wasn't planned, that it had built slowly over months of proximity and stress and the particular loneliness of being close to power without holding any of it himself. He said he understood if I never wanted to speak to him again. I deleted the message without finishing it, though the first sentence stayed lodged in my memory regardless, the way unwanted things always seem to. I also, in those 2 days, went back through years of small moments I had once filed away as meaningless, and watched them rearrange themselves into a different, uglier shape. The late nights Damian claimed were security briefings. The trips where Marcus was always, conveniently, already there ahead of him. The particular ease between them that I had once mistaken for simple friendship, the kind forged by years of shared danger. It is a specific kind of cruelty, discovering that your own memory has been quietly lying to you for longer than you realized. My closest friend, Priya, showed up at my apartment uninvited on the evening of the second day, having grown worried after 2 days of unanswered messages. She let herself in with the spare key I'd given her years earlier, found me still in the clothes I'd been wearing since the discovery, and didn't ask a single question before making tea, and simply sitting beside me on the couch. I told her everything eventually, the whole ugly shape of it, Marcus included, and she listened without interrupting, her expression shifting from concern to a controlled, protective anger on my behalf that I found, oddly, more comforting than sympathy would have been. She told me before she left that night that she had never trusted Marcus fully, something about the way he watched Damian a little too carefully in group settings, though she admitted she'd never had anything concrete enough to voice as a real concern. I asked her why she hadn't said anything sooner. She told me honestly that suspicion without proof rarely helps anyone, and that she hadn't wanted to plant doubt in something that might have been nothing. I understood her reasoning, even as some small, unfair part of me wished she had said something regardless. On the third day, the crying stopped. It didn't stop because the pain disappeared. It stopped because something colder arrived to sit beside the pain, and that something was far more useful to me than grief had ever been. I am good at strategy. It's the entire reason the Vale family trusted me with their money in the first place, the ability to look at a complicated, dangerous situation and find the one clean path through it that nobody else could see. I sat at my kitchen table on the morning of the 4th day with coffee going cold beside me, and I thought, with total clarity, about what I actually wanted. I did not want to disappear quietly. That would have been easier and safer, and it would have let Damian keep believing that what he'd done had cost him nothing. I did not want a public confrontation either, something loud and messy that would only give him and Marcus more of my energy than they'd already stolen. What I wanted was something precise. Something that would sit with Damian for the rest of his life the way a stone sits in a shoe, small and constant and impossible to ignore. I thought about the one name in this world that made Damian's easy confidence disappear entirely. Adrian Kane. If you didn't live in the world I lived in, the name meant nothing to you. If you did, it meant everything. The Kane family and the Vale family had run parallel operations for 2 generations, an uneasy, carefully negotiated truce built on mutual respect and mutual fear. Damian had grown up hearing his father describe Adrian Kane in the tone men usually reserved for natural disasters, something enormous and inevitable that you did not provoke if you valued your life. Damian himself had met Adrian exactly twice in the years I'd known him, and both times he had come home unusually quiet, the kind of quiet that meant he had encountered something that made his own power feel smaller than he liked to admit. Adrian Kane was 36 years old, ran an operation 3 times the size of the Vale family's, and had, according to every piece of information I could gather, been unmarried and famously private his entire adult life. There were no photographs of him smiling in any society column. There were no stories about scandal or excess. There was only the reputation, which was that Adrian Kane did not make mistakes, did not forgive them easily in others, and did not, under any circumstances, involve himself in matters that didn't serve a clear purpose. I decided he would serve my purpose perfectly. I want to be honest, the way I promised myself I would be honest in this telling, even about the parts that don't flatter me. At that kitchen table, my intentions toward Adrian Kane were entirely about Damian. I wanted to walk into Damian's world in a position he could never touch. I wanted him to look at me across whatever room fate eventually put us both in and understand, without me needing to say a single word, exactly what his carelessness had cost him. It was petty. I have never pretended otherwise. But I decided that pettiness was an entirely reasonable response to what had been done to me, and I stopped apologizing for it internally right there at that table. The opportunity arrived faster than I expected. Every year, the handful of families who ran this particular world attended a single shared event, a charity gala hosted at a private estate, ostensibly benefiting children's hospitals, actually functioning as the one occasion where rival operations could observe each other under the cover of good manners and expensive champagne. Attendance at this gala required an invitation, and invitations were controlled entirely by whichever family was hosting that year. That year, it was the Kane family's turn to host. I still had access, at that point, to enough of the Vale family's operational information to know Damian would be attending, and to know, more importantly, that the guest list required confirmation 2 weeks in advance through a formal request. I made mine under my own name, framing myself as an independent financial consultant with professional ties across several of the families, which was, strictly speaking, true. I received my confirmation 4 days later. There was one complication I hadn't fully accounted for in my planning, which was that leaving my position with the Vale family cleanly was never going to be simple. I still held access to accounts and records that made me, whether I liked it or not, someone the family needed to release carefully rather than let walk away angry. Damian's father called me personally 2 days after I submitted my formal resignation. His tone carefully diplomatic in the way powerful men are diplomatic when they need something from you without appearing to need it. He told me the family valued my work enormously, that whatever had happened between Damian and myself was, in his words, a private matter that needn't affect a professional arrangement that had served everyone well for 6 years. I told him, as politely as the situation allowed, that I no longer felt comfortable managing intimate financial details for a family I was no longer going to be part of, and that I had already arranged for a clean, fully documented transition to whoever they chose to bring in next. He didn't push further than that single conversation, though I understood clearly, reading between his careful words, that my departure was being watched closely by people who did not enjoy losing useful things. I spent the 2 weeks before the gala the way I spend every important project, with total, focused preparation. I researched Adrian Kane the way I once researched tax structures, exhaustively, looking for every publicly available detail. His business philosophy, as far as it could be inferred from the handful of legitimate ventures the Kane family used as fronts. The charities he quietly funded, which were more numerous and more genuine than his reputation would have suggested. The particular controlled elegance of everything associated with his name. I bought a suit for the occasion, a deep charcoal that I knew worked well against my own coloring, tailored precisely enough that it required 3 separate fittings. I was not going to that gala to be overlooked. The night of the gala, I arrived exactly 40 minutes after the official start time. Early enough that the evening still had structure, late enough that the room had already warmed into easy conversation and slightly lowered guards. The estate was extraordinary in the specific way old, serious money is always extraordinary, restrained rather than showy, every detail chosen because it was correct rather than because it was expensive. I saw Damian almost immediately, holding court near the center of the room with the effortless magnetism that had once made me feel like the luckiest person alive. He hadn't seen me yet. I let him not see me for a while. I found Adrian Kane standing near the far windows, and the moment I saw him, my careful research revealed itself to be entirely insufficient. Photographs had told me he was tall, dark-haired, formally composed. They had failed completely to communicate the quality of his stillness. Where Damian filled a room by pushing outward, demanding to be noticed, Adrian Kane simply existed within a space and somehow bent the entire room's attention toward him without any visible effort at all. He wore black, unremarkable in description and devastating in execution, and even from 30 feet away, I understood why grown men who ran empires spoke his name carefully. I positioned myself near a piece of art I knew from research he had personally commissioned for the estate, and I waited with the kind of visible, genuine attention that couldn't be mistaken for performance, because at that moment, it wasn't entirely performance. The piece really was extraordinary. I felt him before I heard him approach. "You're looking at that as though you actually see it," he said, his voice low and measured, the kind of voice that told you immediately whatever came next deserved your full attention. I told him the artist's use of restraint was the most interesting thing in the room. More interesting, certainly, than most of the conversations happening around us. Something shifted at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile, the architecture of one. "Most people at these events are here to be seen rather than to see," he said. "You're the second person tonight to actually look at something." We introduced ourselves properly after that. I gave him my name, my professional role, watched him absorb it with the same quiet, comprehensive attention he seemed to give everything. He asked what brought an independent consultant to an event like this one, and I told him, honestly, that I maintained relationships across several operations and preferred to understand the people I worked around rather than simply the numbers they generated. He considered that answer for a moment longer than the answer strictly required, and something in his gaze sharpened with what I would later recognize as genuine interest rather than polite obligation. "You worked with the Vale family," he said. It wasn't a question. I understood, hearing it, that he had known who I was before we ever exchanged names, that whatever information network operated beneath his composed exterior had already told him exactly who had walked into his event that evening. I told him I had, until recently, and left it at that, unwilling to hand him the entire shape of my situation before I understood what he intended to do with it. He didn't press further, though something in his expression told me he understood there was a larger story sitting just beneath my careful answer, and that he was choosing, deliberately, to let me offer it in my own time rather than extracting it from me in a single conversation. That restraint, more than anything else that evening, was what actually caught my attention. Damian had never once, in 4 years, allowed a piece of information to sit unexamined if he could have it immediately instead. Adrian Kane, apparently, understood that some things were worth waiting for. We spoke for nearly 40 minutes. I had prepared several careful conversational avenues designed to make myself memorable, and I used almost none of them, because the conversation itself refused to stay inside any careful structure. Adrian Kane was, infuriatingly, genuinely interesting to talk to. He listened in a way I hadn't experienced from powerful men before, actually listened, rather than performing patience while waiting for his own turn to speak. When I made an observation he found sharp, He told me so directly, without the practiced flattery men in his position usually deployed instead of honesty. Before the evening ended, he asked whether I would be willing to continue our conversation somewhere quieter. Dinner, if I preferred it to coffee. I told him I preferred dinner. He didn't smile fully then, but something in his expression rearranged itself into something I found myself thinking about on the drive home, longer than I had intended to think about it. We had our first dinner 5 days later, at a restaurant that didn't advertise its name on the door and required a level of discretion I recognized immediately as deliberate. Adrian Kane, I learned quickly, moved through the world as a man who had simply arranged for it to accommodate him, not through arrogance, but through the quiet authority of someone who had rarely needed to ask twice for anything. Over that dinner, and over the several dinners that followed across the next month, something happened that I had not built into my original plan at all. I began to genuinely like him. I had prepared for attraction. He was, by any honest measure, extraordinarily compelling, sharp-featured, self-possessed, with a presence that filled a room the way certain quiet things fill a room, entirely without effort. I had prepared for intellectual engagement, because my research had told me clearly that he was formidable. What I had not prepared for was the specific quality of his attention, the way he asked questions that weren't the standard currency of small talk, what actually mattered to me, what I found difficult about my work, what I was afraid of. He asked about my family with a gentleness that surprised me from a man whose professional reputation was built on the word merciless. Our third dinner nearly didn't happen at all. Adrian cancelled that morning with a short, formal message citing an urgent matter, and I remember feeling a small, unexpected drop of disappointment that told me more about how invested I'd already become than I was comfortable admitting to myself at the time. He called that evening instead, later than I expected, and apologized directly rather than through an assistant, explaining, in careful, general terms, that a dispute between two of his operations territories had required his personal attention. He asked, almost hesitantly, whether I would be willing to have a much later dinner, closer to midnight, if I wasn't already asleep. I told him I wasn't, and I meant it in more ways than the literal one. We ended up talking for nearly 3 hours that night, at an hour when the city outside his window had gone quiet in a way that made the conversation feel more private than any of our earlier dinners had. He told me that night about the specific weight of inheriting an empire he hadn't asked for at 24, when his own father died suddenly and left him an organization far larger than he felt prepared to run. I told him, in return, about the specific loneliness of being brilliant at something dangerous and never quite being trusted with the parts of it that mattered most. The way I had spent 6 years managing the Vale family's money without ever once being treated as more than a very useful tool. Somewhere around our 4th or 5th dinner, without my fully noticing the transition, the careful performance I'd been maintaining began to require less staging. I found myself simply being myself across the table from him, and being met, in return, by a version of him that I suspected very few people ever saw. He touched my hand across the table on our 6th dinner, when something I'd said made him laugh, the real, sudden kind of laugh that seemed to surprise him as much as it surprised me. His hand over mine was warm and steady, and I did not pull away. "You are entirely unexpected," he told me, his voice dropping into something lower than his usual register. I asked if that was a complaint. He told me it was the opposite of one. Not everything about that period was gentle, and I don't want to tell this story as though it was. Roughly a month after our first dinner, I received a message from an unknown number that contained a single photograph, a picture of myself entering Adrian's private residence, taken from a car parked across the street. There was no text accompanying it, no explicit threat. There didn't need to be. I understood immediately that someone within the Vale operation was tracking my movements, and I understood, with a colder clarity than I expected, that whoever had sent it wanted me to know I was being watched. I debated telling Adrian for exactly 1 evening before deciding that the honesty I had promised him applied here as much as anywhere else. When I showed him the message, his expression didn't change dramatically, but something in the room's temperature did. He asked me, very calmly, whether I recognized the number, the angle of the photograph, anything that might identify who had taken it. I didn't, not specifically, though I had my suspicions about which of Damian's people might still be loyal enough to do something like this without direct instruction. Adrian made 2 phone calls that night, both brief, both delivered in a tone I hadn't heard from him before, quiet and absolutely without room for negotiation. Within 3 days, my building had a second security presence I hadn't requested and wasn't allowed to decline. Within a week, whoever had sent that photograph never surfaced again. Adrian never told me exactly what those phone calls accomplished, and I understood, in that particular world, that some things were kinder left unasked. It should have frightened me, seeing that side of him so plainly. Instead, I found myself steadier than I expected to be, because for the first time in longer than I could easily measure, someone's power was being used entirely in my direction rather than around me. It happened properly on a Saturday evening, several weeks into whatever this had become. We had spent the afternoon walking through a private gallery he quietly funded, and then through the gardens surrounding it, his pace slow and unhurried in a way I hadn't expected from a man who ran an empire on precision timing. He talked about things that had nothing to do with business, a book he'd recently reread, a city he'd once lived in briefly in his 20s that had changed how he understood solitude. I found myself talking more than I usually allowed myself to with anyone, about my own childhood, about the particular quality of loneliness that had followed me into this dangerous world and somehow never quite left. When we stopped walking near where his car waited, he turned to face me fully, and the way the evening light caught the sharp lines of his face made something in my chest tighten in a way I could no longer explain away as strategy. "I want to ask you something honestly," he said. "Are you actually here, present in this, in whatever this has become between us?" I thought about honesty in that moment, about the fact that I had come to him carrying a plan built on a wound, and that the wound was still real, and so, somehow, was everything that had grown up alongside it. I told him that this wasn't unfolding the way I had expected it to, which was true in every sense that mattered. "That's honest enough for tonight," he said, and then he kissed me. It was nothing like I would have predicted from a man of his reputation. Slow, deliberate, testing whether I would meet it before he allowed it to deepen. When I did meet it, the kiss became something far more certain, his hand steady at my jaw, and for the length of that moment, the entire dangerous, complicated world we both belonged to simply fell away. I should have anticipated that Damian would find out. Our 2 families moved in circles that generated attention whether we wanted it or not, and Adrian's sudden, visible interest in someone did not go unnoticed for long. The call came on a weekday afternoon, from a number I still recognized instantly despite everything. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" Damian demanded, no greeting, no pretense. I told him I was having dinner with an interesting person and didn't see what business that was of his anymore. "You went after Adrian Kane," he said, his voice tightening into something that used to make me flinch and now simply registered as noise. "Do you understand what you're playing with?" I told him I understood perfectly, and that he had forfeited any right to comment on my choices the night I found him in bed with Marcus Reyes, in sheets I had personally helped select. I told him those days of explaining myself to him were finished. "This is insane," he said. "You're doing this to hurt me." Maybe I was, at first, I told him, and something in my own voice surprised me by how steady it had become. But Adrian Kane is a far more remarkable man than you've ever given him credit for. And whatever is happening between us has become more real than anything you and I ever managed to be. "If you think I'm simply going to allow this," he started, his voice dropping into the low register he used to command obedience from people who worked beneath him. I told him, very clearly, that if he tried to interfere in what I had with Adrian, I would not only continue seeing him, I would marry him, and every carefully protected asset Damian believed was permanently secured would suddenly find itself entangled in an entirely different family's interests. I told him to consider carefully whether he wanted to test that threat. The silence that followed was longer than any silence I had heard from him in 4 years together. Then he hung up. He called back 3 days later, in a completely different register, quiet and almost pleading in a way I had never once heard from him in 4 years. He told me he had made the worst mistake of his life, that he understood now what he'd thrown away, that if I gave him even a fraction of a chance he would spend years proving he'd changed. He told me he loved me, that whatever had happened with Marcus had been a moment of weakness rather than a reflection of what he actually wanted, and asked me, directly, to come back. I listened to all of it without interrupting, and when he finished, I told him, as calmly as I could manage, that I believed he probably meant every word of it in that particular moment, and that it changed absolutely nothing about what I had already decided. I told him that love which required catastrophic loss to reveal itself wasn't the kind of love I intended to build the rest of my life around, and that some doors, once they closed as completely as his had closed that Thursday evening, simply didn't reopen no matter how sincerely someone knocked on them afterward. He tried twice more over the following weeks, messages I read and didn't answer, a bouquet delivered to my apartment that I gave to Priya instead of keeping. Each attempt made my resolve steadier rather than softer, because I understood, watching him try to negotiate his way back into something he'd destroyed, that he still believed, on some fundamental level, that sincerity alone should be sufficient to undo consequences. It wasn't a belief I intended to indulge. Adrian learned about my history with Damian before I told him, which I had expected. His intelligence network extended far beyond what I could have kept hidden even if I'd wanted to. When he called and asked me to come to his residence, his tone carefully neutral in a way that told me the conversation ahead mattered enormously, I went without hesitation. He was waiting in his study when I arrived, a glass of something amber untouched on the desk beside him. He didn't sit. I understood, watching him, that this was itself unusual. Adrian Kane, who was the most settled person in any room even standing, now carrying a visible edge of tension. "Damian Vale called me," he said. "He told me you and he were involved for 4 years. He was not generous in his description of your reasons for approaching me." I told him I wouldn't have expected generosity from Damian on that subject. "Were you using me?" he asked, direct as he had always been with me. I did not lie to him. I told him that I had come to that gala with exactly that intention, that I had discovered Damian's betrayal, and wanted him to understand precisely what his carelessness had cost him, and that approaching Adrian had seemed, at the time, like the cleanest way to accomplish that. "And now?" he asked, very still. "And now," I told him, "I am standing in your study telling you the truth at the risk of losing you entirely, which is not something strategy requires. Strategy would have me lying to you indefinitely. I am not doing that, because what started as a plan has become something I am no longer willing to treat as one. You are real to me. This is real to me. And you deserve to hear all of it directly from me, rather than filtered through Damian's version of events." The silence that followed was long enough that I felt every second of it in my chest. Then Adrian set down his glass, crossed the room, and did something I hadn't expected from a man of his height and bearing. He lowered himself in front of where I sat, so that he was looking up at me rather than down. "My understanding of trust has always been narrow," he said quietly. "I have built an entire life around never being caught unprepared by anyone. And somehow I did not see you coming at all." I told him, honestly, that I hadn't seen this coming either. "I have no intention of walking away from this," he said. "But I want everything on the table between us from this point forward. No more strategy hiding underneath what's real." "No more strategy," I agreed. Some weeks later, Adrian invited me to a formal Sunday dinner with a small circle of family he trusted completely, an event I understood, from the careful way he mentioned it, carried more weight than a simple meal. His sister Elena was there, along with 2 of his oldest and most senior lieutenants, men who had served his father before serving him. The conversation moved easily for most of the evening, warm in a way I hadn't necessarily expected from people who spent their working lives managing violence and risk, and I found myself, somewhere around the second course, genuinely laughing at a story Elena told about Adrian's disastrous attempt at cooking for their mother's birthday when he was 17. Toward the end of the evening, one of the older lieutenants, a quiet, serious man named Pharaoh, who had clearly been sizing me up all night, asked me directly what I intended to bring to the family beyond my relationship with Adrian. It wasn't unkind, exactly, but it carried the weight of a real question rather than idle curiosity. I told him honestly that I brought 6 years of expertise in exactly the kind of financial architecture that kept operations like this one safe from exposure, and that I intended to prove that value directly rather than simply asking to be trusted on the strength of Adrian's affection alone. Pharaoh considered that answer for a long moment, then nodded once, and I understood, watching Adrian's small private smile from across the table, that I had passed some kind of test I hadn't fully realized was being administered. There was a night, a few weeks before he asked me to marry him, that I think about often, because it was the moment I understood fully what I had actually found. Adrian had been unusually quiet over dinner, distracted in a way that wasn't typical of him, and when I asked what was on his mind, he told me, after a long pause, about his mother, who had died when he was 19, before he'd inherited any of the responsibility that now defined his entire life. He told me she had been the only person who ever spoke to him without calculating an angle first, and that after she died, he had spent nearly 2 decades assuming that particular kind of honesty simply wasn't available to a man in his position anymore. I asked him why he was telling me this now. He looked at me for a long moment before answering, and when he did, his voice had none of its usual composure. "Because you remind me of what that felt like," he said. And I had stopped expecting to feel it again. I didn't have a clever response to that. I simply reached across the table and held his hand, and we sat like that in silence for a long time, and it was, I think, the moment the last remaining wall between strategy and genuine feeling finally came down completely for both of us. I told my own mother about Adrian roughly 2 months into whatever we had become, a conversation I had been dreading more than I dreaded almost anything else in that entire period. My mother had never fully approved of my life with Damian, though she had made her peace with it quietly over the years, the way parents sometimes do when confronting a choice they can't undo. When I told her I had met someone else, someone from an even larger, even more dangerous world than the one she'd already reluctantly accepted, I expected resistance. Instead, she asked me a single question. She asked whether this one made me feel safe in a way Damian never quite had, despite 4 years of trying. I thought about it honestly before answering, and told her yes, that with Adrian I felt something closer to being fully seen than I had ever felt with anyone, danger and all. She was quiet for a long moment on the phone, and then she told me that safety built on being truly known was worth infinitely more than safety built on being carefully managed, and that she trusted my judgment, even if the world I'd chosen would never be one she fully understood. She met Adrian for the first time a few months before the wedding. Over a lunch he insisted on hosting personally rather than delegating to any assistant. I watched him, that afternoon, deploy an entirely different version of his careful attention, asking her questions about my childhood with a genuine curiosity that had nothing performative in it, listening to her stories about my stubbornness as a child with an amusement he didn't try to hide. When she left that afternoon, she told me quietly that she finally understood what I meant about feeling safe, and that she had rarely seen a man listen to another person the way Adrian had listened to her. He proposed 3 weeks later, in his study, on an ordinary Tuesday evening with no particular occasion attached to it. He didn't kneel, didn't produce an elaborate speech. He simply took my hand, told me that he had spent his entire adult life assuming permanence was something you built through control, and that I had taught him, without meaning to, that it was actually built through choosing someone honestly and continuing to choose them every day afterward. He asked if I would marry him. I told him yes before he'd fully finished the sentence, which felt, in that moment, like a kind of poetic symmetry I chose not to examine too closely. Between the proposal and the wedding, there was a single afternoon that tested everything we had built more thoroughly than anything else in those months. Damian's father requested a private meeting with Adrian, a formal, carefully arranged sit-down between the 2 family heads that I was not initially meant to attend. I learned about it only because Adrian told me himself, the night before, sitting across from me with the particular stillness he wore when something serious required discussion. He asked whether I wanted to be present. I told him I did, that I had spent 6 years being managed and organized around by powerful men discussing my life without my input, and that I had no intention of allowing that pattern to continue now that it directly concerned my own marriage. The meeting itself took place in neutral territory, a private room in a hotel neither family had ties to, with exactly the kind of careful, controlled tension I had expected. Damian's father was polite in the specific way powerful men are polite when they are genuinely uncertain of their footing, raising concerns about stability between the 2 operations, about whether a personal entanglement between our families might complicate the careful truce that had held for 2 generations. Adrian listened to all of it without visible reaction, and when he finally spoke, his answer was simple and entirely without room for further negotiation. He told Damian's father that his marriage was not a matter open for operational discussion, that the truce between the families would hold exactly as well as it always had, and that any attempt to use my presence in his life as leverage against either operation would be treated as a direct provocation rather than a business concern. The meeting ended shortly afterward, and though nothing about the underlying tension between our two families disappeared entirely, I understood, watching Adrian handle that room, exactly how completely he had chosen to stand beside me. We were married 4 months later, in a ceremony small enough that it excluded almost everyone who might have wanted an invitation purely for the sake of proximity to the Kane name. My closest friends attended. Adrian's inner circle, the handful of people he genuinely trusted, attended as well. Damian was not invited, and was informed of that fact through a brief, formal message that left no room for negotiation. The ceremony itself was simple by the standards Adrian could have commanded if he'd wanted something grander. We wrote our own vows and didn't share them with each other beforehand. His were precise and quietly devastating, the way everything he said was intended to be. He told me that he had spent nearly 2 decades believing that control was an acceptable substitute for genuine connection, and that I had walked into his carefully guarded life and proven, with an ease that still unsettled him slightly, exactly how wrong that belief had been. My own vows were simpler, because I had never been the more articulate one between us, but I told him honestly that I had come looking for a weapon and found, instead, a home, and that I intended to spend the rest of my life being worthy of that discovery. We spent our first 2 weeks as a married couple somewhere neither of our operations could easily reach us, a quiet coastal house Adrian's family had owned for decades, deliberately left off any records that might connect it to the Kane name. It was, I think, the only stretch of time in either of our adult lives that had ever been entirely free of obligation. No calls requiring urgent attention, no decisions with consequences beyond what we wanted to eat or where we wanted to walk that particular morning. I remember one evening in particular, sitting on the porch as the sun went down over water neither of us bothered naming or identifying. Adrian reached over and took my hand without any particular occasion prompting it, simply because he wanted to, and told me that this, exactly this, ordinary and unremarkable and entirely his, was the thing he had spent 2 decades of accumulating power without ever actually managing to build for himself. I told him he had built it now, and meant it completely. The physical closeness between us during those 2 weeks deepened into something neither of us rushed, careful and unhurried in the way everything about him seemed to be, his attention as thorough in that part of our life together as it was in every other part of it. It was, without needing further description than that, the place where the last of any remaining distance between us finally dissolved entirely. I want to tell you honestly that the months following our wedding were the most complicated and most genuinely peaceful months of my adult life. Adrian loved with the same total precision he brought to everything else in his world, which meant that once he had decided I was worth loving, he did it completely, without hesitation or half measures. He remembered every detail I mentioned in passing. He included me as a genuine participant in decisions that mattered to him, not as decoration attached to his public image. He was, in the quiet architecture of our private life, far gentler than the reputation that preceded him into every room. Marriage into the Kane family meant learning an entirely new set of responsibilities, and I won't pretend the adjustment was effortless. Where the Vale operation had run on charisma and improvisation, the Kane family ran on precision, every decision documented, every risk measured twice before it was ever acted on. Adrian gave me, within the first month of our marriage, oversight of several legitimate business fronts the family used to launder a portion of its income, the same kind of work I had once done for Damian's family, except now I was doing it as a genuine partner rather than a useful employee kept slightly outside the family's real trust. There was resistance to that, at first, from a handful of Adrian's older lieutenants who had known him since before either of us had met. Men who quietly believed that an outsider from a rival family's inner circle couldn't possibly be trusted with real information. Adrian handled that resistance the way he handled everything else, directly and without excessive discussion. In a meeting I wasn't originally meant to attend, I later learned he had told his assembled leadership that anyone who questioned my place in the family a second time would be questioning his judgment directly, and that he did not intend to have that particular conversation twice. Nobody questioned it again after that. 6 weeks after our wedding, I was at a private event with Adrian, an operational summit between several families that occasionally required his presence, when Damian appeared across the room. He looked older than the version of him I had loved for 4 years, the easy confidence replaced by something that read, to my honestly appraising eye, like a man encountering the consequences of his own choices for the first time in his sheltered life. He approached carefully, the way you approach something you're no longer certain you're permitted near. "You look well," he said, which was, I understood, his way of asking a much larger question without asking it directly. I told him I was well. Genuinely, completely well, in a way I hadn't believed myself capable of feeling again after that Thursday evening. "I made a mistake," he said. "I have known that since the night it happened. I am sorry, Julian. I need you to know that, even if it changes nothing." I looked at him for a long moment, and found that the anger I had carried into that gala months earlier had resolved into something quieter, something closer to simple clarity. "What you did hurt me in ways I am still working through honestly," I told him. "And I made choices, in that pain, that I might have made differently under other circumstances. But those choices led me somewhere true. So I am not angry anymore. I have moved past it. I hope, genuinely, that you find something true of your own eventually." Something moved across his face that was more complicated than simple regret. The particular anguish of a person realizing they have not only lost something, but have watched it become something better in every measurable way without them. Adrian's hand arrived at the small of my back before Damian could respond. Warm and familiar, and entirely unhurried. "Vale," Adrian said, and the temperature in his voice was the coldest register I had ever heard him use. Not angry, which would have been warmer, simply final. Damian's posture shifted immediately, the automatic recalibration of a man encountering something significantly larger than himself. "You will not approach my husband again," Adrian said. "This is not a negotiation. It is information." Damian looked at me one final time. I met his eyes without flinching, and without cruelty either. I had nothing left to prove to him, and nothing left to take from him. "Take care of yourself," I told him, and I meant it honestly. He walked away, and this time, I didn't watch him go. I turned instead toward the warmth already waiting beside me. My real chance to prove that my place in the Kane family wasn't simply a courtesy extended to Adrian's husband came a few months after that encounter, when one of the family's legitimate shipping fronts came under sudden, aggressive scrutiny from a regulatory body that had never previously shown interest in its operations. It became clear within days that someone had deliberately routed information toward that regulator, a leak that threatened to unravel financial structures that had taken years to build carefully around exactly this kind of exposure. Adrian's senior people spent 2 days working the problem from the outside, trying to identify who might have leaked the information and how to contain the regulatory interest before it spread further. I spent those same 2 days doing what I actually knew how to do, going back through years of financial documentation until I found the precise structural weakness that had made the leak effective in the first place, a gap in how funds moved between 2 subsidiary accounts that I recognized instantly because I had closed an almost identical gap for the Vale family years earlier. I brought the solution to Adrian directly rather than routing it through his usual chain of advisors, and I watched something shift in the way his senior lieutenants looked at me afterward, once the fix I'd proposed had quietly resolved a problem they'd spent 2 days failing to identify. Adrian himself said very little about it publicly, which I understood, by then, was simply how he operated. But that night, alone together, he told me that watching me work that problem had been the first time he fully understood, rather than simply believed, why the Vale family had once trusted me with everything they owned. Not every remaining thread from my old life resolved as peacefully as the leak had. Roughly 10 months into our marriage, a car followed mine for nearly 20 minutes on a night I was driving home alone from a dinner with my mother, too closely and too deliberately to be coincidence. I didn't recognize the vehicle, but the sustained, patient way it stayed exactly 2 cars behind me told me everything about its intention. I called Adrian rather than driving straight home, and he stayed on the line with me, his voice perfectly level, even as I could hear him giving quiet instructions to someone else in the background, until I reached a location his people could secure. It turned out, in the days that followed, to have been arranged by a mid-level figure within what remained of the Vale operation, someone who had apparently decided, independently of Damian and without his knowledge, that removing me from the situation entirely might restore some version of the old order. Adrian's response to that information was swift and, from what I understood without asking for details, thoroughly final. Damian called me himself 2 days later, his voice tight with something that sounded, unexpectedly, like genuine alarm rather than possessiveness, insisting he'd had no knowledge of the plan and would never have condoned it. I believed him, mostly, though I understood by then that his belief in his own control over the people beneath him had always been more fragile than his confidence suggested. Adrian didn't discuss the details of how that particular threat was resolved, and I didn't ask him to. What I understood clearly, in the aftermath, was that I had married a man who would burn down anything that threatened what we'd built together, and that the danger inherent in his world, the same danger I had once viewed only from its financial edges, now existed to protect me rather than merely surround me. There was an evening, some months later, when the entire complicated architecture of my new life had settled into something I recognized, with quiet astonishment, as genuine peace. Adrian and I sat together in our private study, rain moving steadily against the windows, and he asked me, without looking up from what he was reading, whether I was still afraid, referencing something I had admitted to him quietly in the earliest weeks of our marriage. I thought about the question honestly before I answered. No, I told him. Not anymore. Good, he said, and his arm found its way around my shoulders with the specific weight of a promise he had already kept and intended to keep for a very long time. By that point, nearly a year into our marriage, the life I had built with Adrian had stopped feeling like the aftermath of anything and had simply become my life, entire and uncomplicated by comparison to what came before it. I had grown genuinely close to the small circle of people around him, particularly his younger sister, Elena, who had been skeptical of me in the beginning and had become, over the months, one of the few people outside our marriage I trusted completely. We spent Sunday mornings together sometimes, the three of us, in a quiet domestic ritual that would have seemed impossible to imagine from the vantage point of that Thursday evening when everything I thought was solid collapsed on a bedroom floor. Marcus reached out once more, nearly a year after everything happened, this time in a proper letter rather than an unfinished voicemail. He didn't ask for forgiveness directly, which told me it had been written carefully by someone who understood he wasn't owed one. He wrote that he had left the Vale operation entirely, that he was building something smaller and entirely his own in another city, and that he wanted me to know, even if it meant nothing coming from him, that he was sorry in a way he hadn't been capable of articulating honestly at the time it mattered. I didn't respond. I also didn't throw the letter away. It sat in a drawer for a long time afterward, an unresolved note I wasn't ready to either forgive or discard completely, which felt, in its own complicated way, like an honest place to leave it. I had walked into that gala planning to wound someone who had wounded me first. What I found instead, entirely outside any plan I had built, was a life built on honesty rather than performance, on being fully known rather than carefully managed. I had come looking for revenge. I found, instead, exactly where I was always supposed to end up. And if you had told me, on that Thursday evening when everything I thought was permanent fell apart on a bedroom floor, that I would end up here, genuinely at peace, genuinely home, I don't think I would have believed you. I would have told you that a person doesn't recover from watching 6 years of trust collapse in a single unguarded moment, that the best you could hope for afterward was a careful, guarded kind of survival rather than anything resembling real happiness. I would have been wrong, and I am glad, looking back on it now, that I was wrong. There are still days when the memory of that bedroom surfaces uninvited, quieter now, less sharp, but never entirely gone. I don't think grief like that disappears completely, no matter how thoroughly your life rebuilds itself around something better. What changes is the weight of it, the amount of room it's allowed to take up in a life that has since filled with things far more solid than the version of happiness I once mistook for permanent. Adrian knows about those days when they arrive. He has never once treated them as a threat to what we've built, only as a part of me he's willing to hold space for, without needing me to perform healing faster than it actually arrives. Elena calls me family now, without qualification, the way she calls her own brother family, and I have stopped flinching internally every time she does it. My mother visits often, and watches Adrian with the quiet, satisfied attention of a parent who has finally stopped worrying, after years of worrying about a life she never fully understood. And Damian, when I think of him now, no longer arrives with the sharp edge he once carried in every memory. He exists, in my mind, mostly as a lesson I am grateful, in some complicated way, to have learned as thoroughly as I did, because without that single unbearable Thursday evening, I would never have found my way to the man sitting beside me now, reading quietly in the low evening light, entirely unaware that I am watching him and thinking, for perhaps the 1000th time since our wedding, that I would make every one of these choices again exactly as they happened. But the heart, I have learned, is not a strategic instrument at all. It is an embarrassingly honest one. It finds what it needs whether or not you ever intended to let it.